All right, so we're going to go through this. We'll break it down. And Darla sent me a question we should be covering it. It was on verse 9. So we should. I believe I put the answer in. If not, let me know. Verse 1. Can you read that for me?
I said to myself, go ahead, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy what is good. But it turned out to be futile. All
right, so we need to be reminded that futility, what does your translation say? Some say futility, meaninglessness, or meaningless, and vanity. Any other words? Emptiness. Regardless, the Hebrew word communicates something important. It's very dense and it carries with it various meanings. One of the meanings that we find in Ecclesiastes is that it is a fleeting breath or vapor. So it's not something that's going to be here. If you kind of visualize when you go outside when it's cold, you can see your breath, and what does it do? It dissipates. And so when he speaks of meaninglessness, that's what he's talking about. He's talking about something that is fleeting, something that is not going to stick around. It is very temporary, okay? But when we come to meaningless, he's not just saying that everything is absolutely without purpose. That's not what he's getting at. But what he is addressing is the fleeting things that will not last. Okay, so that's another thing we've got to remember. When he drops that phrase, meaningless, vanity, so on, futile, he's referring to something that is going to be fleeting, which then has to draw us back to, okay, well, what is not fleeting? And so that's kind of where we're going. Verse 2.
Laughter, I said, is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish?
And so I find it interesting, again, in the Hebrew, the same word used here for, my translation says senseless, yours says madness. Foolish. It's interesting because the same word used here for that is also used for praise. It seems like a very strong contrast, does it not? And it's interesting because there are several words in Hebrew that he could have used, which would have said senseless, would have said madness, could have used those, and yet he goes with the word that has almost polar opposites in meaning, yet within the same word. And I think this is something that the English language really misses out on. When you come across the Hebrew language and the Greek language, you have a lot more depth that come with their words. And so one of the things we can gain from this is he chose that word for a purpose. There's a reason he chose the word senseless or madness that has two polar opposites of meaning. Which again, it kind of goes back to, if he's speaking of that which is fleeting, what does it leave? Well, what is non-fleeting? If this is meaningless, the things that flee and the things that are temporal, well then what is permanent? And the same thing goes for this madness that he's talking about with laughter. So he's not saying laughter per se is madness, it's foolish. Because there is certainly joy that is permanent, right? And we find that joy, we find that laughter in our praise of God. And that's obviously, as we know, what eternity is going to bring us. And so it's important that we understand, if you want to highlight that word or underline that word, make note that it has two polar opposite definitions. And he chose that word for a reason, when there were various other ones. Verse 3.
I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives.
All right, so we've got to remember that though Solomon is essentially embarking on this qualitative research, he's doing so with tact. I know there's going to be verses, and there's one in this chapter specifically, where it's going to seem like he's doing this experiment with just reckless abandon. That's not so. He is doing it tactfully. He is doing it even with reservation. He's not just throwing himself into it belligerently. Okay? He is doing it within a certain parameter. His wisdom does not permit him to, and also his faith with the Spirit of God does not allow him to just go, I'm going to foolishly and recklessly do this. I mean, if you're trying to essentially, it seems like this is some kind of experiment. You can't do that without a cognitive reasoning involved. If you just shut off your intellect and that's it, then you're going to gain nothing from it. And it seems like Solomon is really investing in this for a purpose. And so he does so. The book can be easy for us to get caught up in the negativity of it, but in this part of verse 3, we see that there is a hope which Solomon has. So, though he's embarking on this experiment, Solomon knows that there is good. He says, until I could see what good there is for the sons of mankind to do under heaven for the few years they have of their lives. It can get lost in it as he mentions the few years they have of their lives. Okay, obviously he's talking about death. That's pretty morbid. But he does establish there is, in fact, something good. And that's what he's looking for. But, if you recall last week, it seems like Solomon is kind of embarking on this journey from a naturalistic, almost atheistic perspective of what does mankind and man only itself have to offer in fulfillment. And he gives you his conclusion right up front. There's no, what does he say? Meaningless, vanity, vanity. So he gives us this conclusion, but he does know that there is good. He knows for a fact that there is good. Could you read verses 4 through 8?
I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart.
700 wives.
Yeah. Does that honestly sound like a wise man?
Glutton for punishment.
Yeah. Tim Keller was discussing, he was discussing the subject of kind of homosexuality with a questioner. And of course, there kind of becomes this rogue trail that they go on to try and trap him. And one of the things they talked about was stuff like this with, Solomon and 700 wives. And Tim Keller goes, the Bible's very clear that marriage is intended for one man and one woman. And anyone else who doesn't do that has a terrible time of it. And he's absolutely right. But something that really jumped out to me, which I don't have it here, is that even in his wisdom, even with all the wisdom that Solomon did have, he still was human, and this is clearly a point of weakness that he had. It was very clearly a point of weakness. His sexual depravity was something that he struggled with, very evidently. We'll talk about the wives here in a moment, but concubines, it was hard to find commentaries who would touch it, because the fact is that's what they were there for, a purpose. And, no one wants to talk about it. Especially when it comes to people like Solomon and people we kind of look up to and things like that. But the first point that we got to make here is how Solomon speaks of his endeavors. He says, I built houses for myself. I planted vineyards for myself. I made gardens and parks for myself. I made ponds, water for myself. Now, as we know, what Solomon's conclusion is, even with these endeavors of building and all this growth, the conclusion remains the same, right? In fact, Jesus speaks to this as well in Luke chapter 12. If you want to write this down, you can. We're not going specifically to it. But in Luke chapter 12, verses 13 through 21, he gives the parable of the foolish rich man. And so as you read about this man, his dialogue with himself is the same way. He says, my crops, my barns, my grain, my goods. And what does Jesus conclude? The second part of verse 15, he says, life does not consist in the abundance of possessions. And so Solomon is realizing this. I built all this stuff. I accomplished all these endeavors. I made all these things. And then what does he come to find? Yet again, where's the purpose? Where's the meaning? And that's what Jesus speaks to in Luke 12 as well. The second point that must be addressed is the speaking of slaves as well as concubines. When we see the word slave, the first thing that pops in is obviously American slavery. That is the scarlet letter of our history, and that's where we're first drawn to. But there's a few things involved with that we've got to clarify. These slaves may very well have been bond slaves, which are people who are in debt. There was no such thing as bankruptcy back then, so you sold yourself in, you worked until you paid it off, and when you paid it off, you were set free. But what's also interesting is there are those who would do that, and then when they were eligible to be free, they would actually stay on as slaves the rest of their lives. Now, does that sound like what we think of when we think of slavery? No. So if somebody was a bond slave and then they're able to go free and they choose to stay, what does that say about their master?
They had a good master who treated them decent.
Treated them decent, didn't view them as less than, treat them as less than, took care of them. In fact, one of the things that Solomon mentions here is, yes, he did buy slaves, but he also allowed slaves to reproduce, which meant he had more mouths to feed. Right? But he still took care of them. And so what I think we're seeing here is certainly not the image that conjures up in our mind. It's not the American slavery we see. But there's no way to get around it. The fact is we know that he's married 700 women. We know that he has, I don't know what the number, I thought it might have been 300 concubines, I'm not sure. 300. Might as well make things an even thousand. But
Even with some of the possessions, when you read about Solomon had like horses from Egypt and all this stuff in Kings. If you go back to Deuteronomy, he's not supposed to have those as the king, right? So he's doing it at some point in his life. He's in pursuit of something that he's not finding. So.
yeah, Deuteronomy 17, for this, it speaks of that as well in 17. But the verse I was looking at is the first part of 17. It says, "He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray."
Yeah,
But it also talks about the possessions.
when he takes the throne of the kingdom, the king must not acquire a great number of horses for himself or make people return to Egypt to get more of them. He must not take many wives, yeah. So, and then you read the Kings, that's exactly where all his horses are from.
I think that's kind of good advice, you know.
Yeah.
I'm just saying.
No, I mean,
Good advice.
yeah, anyone, I mean, what woman doesn't want to share a guy?
With 999.
Yeah.
What guy could deal with that?
Even Notorious B.I.G. couldn't think of it. He only had 99 problems, but having 699 other problems would be pretty rough. One of the other things to point out is a commentator said this. He said, "But the worst of Solomon's sins are recorded in 1 Kings 11, 1 through 13. Apparently, Solomon had a weakness for forbidden women. For he married 700 women and had another 300 concubines, many from nations God had prohibited the Israelites from marrying into, and because they would lead them to worship other gods." What did Solomon end up doing?
He built high places for them and worshipped other gods.
And worshipped other gods. So doubtless many of these marriages were politically expedient. The purpose of it were an alliance. It's also the giftings, why he probably had so much livestock and horses, that probably came with the marriage endowment or so on. It might have come with the marriages as well. So not only am I going to marry this princess from Egypt, the father's also going to give me a dowry, and I'm going to grow in possessions. And yet this is against what God has permitted. God said, don't do these things. And so even in his wisdom, he clearly had weaknesses. One, Dr. Peter Gentry said this, and I like the way he worded it. He said, "We have the wisdom of Solomon in what he wrote, but we don't see the wisdom of Solomon in how he lived." And I think we all can see glimpses of that in our own lives. It doesn't negate the wisdom that is there, but it does kind of make you go, well, how does it not take root and spring forth into action? And so Solomon certainly had wisdom, but he did make some foolish decisions, one of which the ladies. If only, and then also the possessions. Verses 9 through 10. Okay, before I get on to that, when the Bible records these things, and there is no clear indication of God's approval, then we have to understand this is historical narrative, that it is simply recording the facts. The Bible's not setting out to say the Bible approves of this. This is a fallacy done by non-believers, that because the Bible records it, therefore the Bible must condone it. No. If it is a historical document and recording it, and personally I'm glad it does it this way. Every single hero that we look up to is tarred and feathered. Every one of them. There's only one that isn't. And there's only one who can't be. He's perfect. And so, just because it's recorded, it doesn't mean that the Bible condones it. And so we can't make that error. The Bible simply is recording Solomon messed up.
For me, that's always made the Bible more true to me, because every single hero in it is flawed. They had human weaknesses, and the Bible's it doesn't sugarcoat it. Like the stuff that Samson did. Several Noah. Here he acted in faith for 100 years, building this boat, and the first thing he does when he gets off the boat is get drunk. It's just so human, and I think that gives credence to the Bible, and it doesn't sugarcoat that men are flawed and they have weaknesses.
And when you look at other holy books, what do they try and do? They try and erase the flaws of the person. What's that?
Turn them into gods.
They turn him into some sort of deity. For example, Joseph Smith. It is well known his past of treasure hunting and things like that, and divination and whatever. But now we're going to overlook that because we've removed it from our sources. We've removed it from that. And so they try and deify them. And it's kind of the same thing. You can look at Muhammad. Same thing. They'll say, oh, he married Aisha at the age of 6 when he was 53. That's creepy. But at least he is decent, didn't consummate until she was 9. It's a top-notch dude right there, right? But you want to sweep particular things under the rug, you want to overlook. Why? Because you're trying to make someone more than they are, but the Bible flat out just does not do that. You can look at the Apostle Paul, and we know he was murderous. We know that he had a lot of discipleship in his life. Several times he records going back and being discipled by Peter to make sure he's preaching the right gospel. It's very evident. All the heroes of the Bible are tarred and feathered. Why? Because they're humans. And Solomon had an Achilles heel for possessions and women. And in many cases, both of those went together. Can you read verse 9 through 10 for me?
I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil.
All right, so this is the verse I was talking about, which would lead someone to believe that Solomon did this without any restraint whatsoever. But we know that this is not the case. And so if we can, just kind of imagine his wisdom sets up a perimeter, almost like a yard where you would let your dogs out so they can't escape. But he can go anywhere he wants in that area. Okay? He knows here's the barrier, here's where I'm not going to pass. But I can do anything in there. And that's essentially how he's pursuing this. It's not just reckless abandon. There's very much tact to it. There is wisdom in it, even though there's not so much in the rest of his life. Verse 11.
Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. A chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun.
He built, he made, he accumulated, and what was his conclusion?
He didn't mean anything.
What's that?
Accomplished.
Meaningless.
And what's something we can take from this? Looking at that passage, looking at what he just covered about what he built and all the things he did, and then he looks at all the things, all the labor I accomplished. I find it to be, what is that? What can we take from that?
Won't get caught up in material things.
Don't get caught up in material things. You know, a career is not going to give us purpose. A bigger home, a nicer car, all this is what he's talking about. It's fleeting. It's fleeting. Those are the things that are, you know, and I don't want to go too far ahead because I think he communicates it very well beginning in verse 18, so I don't want to take away his power or you know, kind of his conclusion. But like Matt Chandler said, all the stuff you possess are future yard sale items. And that's got to put things into perspective. At some point, no matter how nice our car is, it's going to be that car at someone's house that someone's saying, I'm going to restore, but never gets to, and then his wife's upset. It's going to be that car. All right? It's going to be that car that's just falling apart in a junkyard. And so these are the vapors that essentially we find ourselves chasing after. And so Solomon does this for us, and what does he conclude? Don't do it. And yet in America, what are we constantly after? If I get this, if I do this, then it's going to fulfill me. It's going to give me that sense of gratitude and enjoyment in life. I'm trying to remember the movie. I don't think it was Liar Liar. I'm trying to remember the movie, but you know, he worked in a law firm and kept trying to work his way up for promotions, and he absolutely abandoned his family and lost it. And then he just finally realizes that I've been chasing it was another one. It was Click. So he kept fast forwarding through things to kind of get to his promotion. Well, what else was he fast forwarding through? His children growing up and all those memories. And ultimately the ending of the movie is good because he realizes this and is able to redo it and not miss those vital moments. He pursued the things that were fleeting and the vapors, and then what does he find out? The things that are actual meaningful and give us purpose. Those things I completely overlooked. And so those possessions, the home, the car, the career, you know, it's not bad to have a career. It is bad to have a career that takes you from your family. I mean, what would be more important, that they have mom or dad home, or that you make 10 grand more? You know, kids won't know the difference. They want mom or daddy. Verse 12 through 17.
Then I turned my thoughts to consider wisdom and also madness and folly. What more can the king's successor do than what has already been done? I saw that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fool walks in the darkness. But I came to realize that the same fate overtakes them both. Then I said to myself, the fate of the fool will overtake me also. What then do I gain by being wise? And I said to myself, this too is meaningless. For the wise, like the fool, will not be long remembered. The days have already come when both will be forgotten, or have been forgotten. Like the fool, the wise too must die. So I hated life, because the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. All of it is meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
All right. All that is kind of concluded in verse 17. But we've got to remember, what does under the sun mean? We talked about it a little bit last week. What is under the sun?
The physical, the carnal.
The physical human life here, he's looking at the finite. He's looking at human existence with humans around and so on. It's a naturalistic approach, naturalistic view. So what happens under the sun, just as human beings, as looking at it from an atheistic worldview of you're just stardust, you're an accident, and this is what it is. And he says being wise is better, does he not? Well, what's he pulling from right there? He's not pulling from the vapors. How can he recognize that being wise is like being able to see in the darkness? What's he pulling from there?
The spiritual?
Yeah, he's pulling from the spiritual, he's pulling from the eternal, he's pulling from the things that are not fleeting. He recognizes that wisdom is good, that wisdom is helpful. And then he snaps back into it and goes, okay, well, let's look at wisdom from this perspective. whether you're wise or foolish, you're going to end up in the grave. He goes, so what does it benefit me to be wise if I'm just going to live and die and be buried next to a fool? Well, that's a very good question.
Your tomb might be a little more decorative.
What's that?
Your tomb might be a little more decorative.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, at least people might have a little bit more room in there.
But after 400 or 500 years, somebody will steal it and put you in a museum.
Yeah.
So
They'll they'll take your body out and put you somewhere, and you don't get to stay there.
Well, this is just getting brighter and brighter.
But what I do find very interesting, though, is even though for a moment he's pulling from the eternal, he's pulling from wisdom being a true benefit to life, and he shifts hard to now, what is wisdom in light of the human experience and human experience alone? What's the very first thing he says in 17? So I hated life. If that doesn't sound like depression, I don't know what does.
I can kind of relate to that. I think about my life just trying to be principled to the things I think are right and true, and how that doesn't benefit me at all in this life. It actually causes me a lot of grief to stay true to things I believe in. So I can kind of put myself, what benefit is that to me? Why shouldn't I just compromise my principles? But
Compromise that, manipulate, whatever. I mean, because every single person has a God. They don't call it God because they want to be, deep and spiritual without a spirit or whatever. I don't know. It makes no sense to me. Idolatry is still the primary sin of this world. I know narcissism is pretty brutal now, but still it comes down to idolatry. Because why will we not bend our knee to Christ and His salvation? Well, because I don't need Him as a God. Because why? I have this as a God. This God is satisfying me. And that God could be family, it could be kids, it could be a career, it could be the next endeavor, it could be the work that you put in. We all have gods. And we all worship something. But it's not until we worship the one that we actually get things put into perspective. But if our job is our God, then I'm going to do everything to make sure that this God fulfills me. And hook or crook, it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter how you get to the top, it's that you get to the top. But then you also find that, when people have gotten there, they just kind of look around and I really wish I could remember the story. But he got to the top and he goes, I expected it to feel different. I thought it was gonna feel better for longer, and it wasn't.
Well, then the excitement's over. Once you made your goal, it's like.
And maybe their God really was the work to get there, not there. Well, now that God's gone because you're there. So now what do? You want to start at the bottom again? Well, no, I'm at the top. And so this is one of the things that we kind of see Solomon getting at is, I made it to the top, I created all these things, I built all these things, all this labor, everything, and then I look around and I know that wisdom has value, but in the perspective of the human condition, what worth is it to be wise when you're going to die like a fool anyway? And so where does he fall? Naturally, he says, I hated life. He falls into despair, he falls into depression. How could we not fall into depression? If that's the only way we can see life, how is that not depressing? To say, no matter what I do, it's going to matter to no one in 2 generations. Well, that's very depressing. But that's also the vapor that he's been speaking of, right? These are the things that are fleeting. Even our very life is fleeting, but there are things that certainly are eternal. And we're going to come back around to that. But his focus is on the vapor. Here's where I think he makes a very, very good point. Verses 18 through 23.
I hated all the things I had toiled for under the sun, because I must leave them to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether that person will be wise or foolish, yet they will have control over all the fruit of my toil, into which I have poured my effort and skill under the sun. This too is meaningless. So my heart began to despair over all my toilsome labor under the sun. How far?
23.
For a person may labor with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, and then they must leave all they own to another who has not toiled for it This too is meaningless and a great misfortune. What do people get for all the toil and anxious striving with which they labor under the sun? All their days their work is grief and pain, even at night their minds do not rest. This too is meaningless.
Again, we see the phrase, under the sun. So what's he speaking of? He's speaking of the finite, right? And looking at it, what does he kind of say? All this stuff I've accumulated, what does it end up doing?
It's going to go to your dumb kids who don't know what to do with it.
It can go to your spoiled kids, it can go, or I remember there was a comedian talking about all these doomsday preppers. He goes, you do realize all you're doing is prepping for the strongest person on the street. He's like, you're getting all this stuff ready, and all the strongest person has to do is come in and take you out, and now they have all your stuff. I mean, he's like, so why would I prep when you're doing it? But this is what he's getting. He says, I can build all this stuff. I can accomplish all these things, and it's for the next person. And one of the things he mentions is they're going to get it, and they didn't have to work for it. They didn't have to achieve it. Fortunately, I'm broke, and so my kids are going to start like where I was, ground zero. Difference is I'm going to make sure they work hard in school and get scholarships, and make sure they get a free education, because Daddy ain't going to be able to pay for it. It's funny, I listen to people say, oh, we got to save for our kids' college. I'm like, how? How? You can pay for one semester of board or one semester of food. That's pretty much, with how schools are, I don't just see how you can do it. So Heather and I made the decision, our investment in their education is going to make sure that they develop strong study habits, that they develop a strong work ethic, and then get scholarships and go to school that way. Sally Mae will give you a full ride, but Sally Mae comes knocking. And so verse 18 through 19, I think, sums this up perfectly. He says, I built all this stuff, and really all I did was I built it to leave it for the next person. And the next person didn't have to do what I had to do to get there. And what does that kind of communicate? If they didn't have to go through the toils and the labor to get to where now you are, what does that kind of communicate about the person coming in?
Who's the wise one and who's the fool?
It can go that way. Is the person who's coming in going to be grateful?
They're not going to appreciate
Oh, yeah.
it.
They're not going to appreciate. And why would there not be appreciation?
They didn't work for it.
They didn't have to work for it.
Our neighbor, in just the last few days, has gotten sick, and their family has come in with dumpsters and went through their house, and everything's gone. And it just is so hard to believe that somebody's whole life would just be sent out in the dumpster.
You're seeing it from Solomon's perspective, though. And that should help, that should certainly be, I mean, you're seeing it firsthand, what Solomon's talking about. From a worldly perspective, what is this? Maybe somebody comes in, I'm fortunate enough where I have several of Charlie's commentaries now, and I love commentaries, being able to study the Bible a little bit more. That's wonderful. But if, nobody takes them, then where do they end up going? And so I think 18 and 19 summarizes it really well, where I did all this stuff and it's just left to the next person. There's a good chance they're probably going to be ungrateful because they didn't work for it. And he's like, and worldly wise, under the sun, what's really the point in all that? Verses 24 through 25.
A person can do nothing better than to eat and drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too, I see, is from the hand of God. For without him, who can eat or find enjoyment?
25? 26, I'm sorry.
To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness. But to the sinner, he gives the task of gathering and storing up wealth to hand it over to the one who pleases God. This too is meaningless, a chasing after the wind.
Fortunately, Solomon ends on a good note. We were plowing down the road of kind of going, I'm starting to hate life too, Solomon. But what does he say? The breakthrough is, well, what is good? Verses 24 and 25. The joy we find in life is actually from the things that we very much overlook. Would you be willing, can you please read Matthew 6, 31 through 33?
Find it again.
You're good.
31 to 33.
I've got it. Okay. So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows that you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well.
And so what we're seeing is the things that we overlook become the very things that are from God. Even though, yes, our bodies are eventually going to fail and we're going to pass, the things that are provided from God are not the vapors. They're not the vapors of this world. They're not the things that are fleeting. I can't help but kind of think about your time together at the dinner table. Even though our daughters are very young, I had the tendency of being on the phone while we're eating dinner because it's not very stimulating for me. And Heather said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to have dinner together. And so what was very interesting, and Mimi can tell you, is we were eating, and once you got to get somewhere, you got to do things, you get focused on getting them fed, and Evelyn started eating, and then when Heather and I sat down, we look at her, and Evelyn makes eye contact with me, and she goes, and she knows when we say, let's pray, that's what she does. And so we sit down, and she looks at me and goes, and I go, you're right, Evelyn, we need to pray. We haven't prayed for our food. And so a year old, 4 months. Those things are not vapors. I mean, because if you think about the things in which that come, for example, you lead your family comes to saving grace in Jesus Christ. Then your grandkids, and then their grandkids. Though they don't remember your name, there's a lineage of Christ which flowed through you to them. That is not a vapor. That is what gives for all eternity. And you got to be a part of that chain that links them to the one who is good. And this is the thing that I think we've got to take from this, especially here towards the end, is he says that he sprinkles the negativity in, and it kind of gets overlooked. He says there's nothing better for a person than to eat and drink and show himself some good in his trouble. This too I have seen. That is from the hand of God. And one of the things Jesus is mentioning in Matthew 6 is you're getting caught up on all this pursuit, all this stuff. God knows you need those things. He knows that you need them. Pursue the infinite, and I will take care of the things that are essential for the finite. But what Solomon is doing is he's saying, well, what if I remove that connection and just try and pursue worldly pleasures by the purposes of man? And we come to the same conclusion, meaningless. And so even the simple things of just eating and sleeping and sharing that time with loved ones, it gets completely redefined when we're connected to God and not pursuing our own things. When we're seeking first His kingdom, and then that begins to flow through us. And again, we talked about how generationally, how that can keep flowing. And as far as what will happen is my daughters come to faith. What that links to is, I'm going to talk about him a little bit this Sunday, is a football coach. Just a football coach. I loved him, I respected him, and I went to church with him, and he became my Christian father. And now someone who wasn't my flesh and blood is now part of that stream, which is completely changing generationally through my bloodline and my kids. I mean, that's just incredible. But that's not a vapor. We can see that, know that that's eternal, know that there is certainly purpose and meaning behind it. And so even though Solomon can get real negative and real harsh, he concludes here that there still is good, but we know where that good is. We know the only place which good can come, and it comes from the hand of God. Any thoughts? Any questions? Anything to add?
The key to the whole thing is just to have the realization that it is his, it's not ours.
Realization of what?
That all those material things are his, they're not ours.
Yeah. And he's leaving them here. So what does that say about him?
Can't take it with you.
Nope.
If you had it all converted to gold and could take it with you, you just got a piece of asphalt. You know,
I know, it's kind of weird. The very thing we kill each other over, God paves the streets with. I mean, you couldn't imagine someone killing somebody over some black tar somebody just laid down. No, because it's concrete. That's dirt and sand. Well, guess how valuable that is in heaven? He paves his roads with it. We're down here murdering each other for it and taking and pillaging, and God goes, I'll show you how valuable that really is. He goes, I'm going to pave my streets with it. You know, it puts into perspective the very things we find most valuable. But but who walks on those streets? It's going to be his children. It's going to be him. I mean, he's already moonwalking down it with Louise right now. But when we get there, we're going to be walking on it, right? That's not the vapor. That's certainly the joy and goodness. Any other thoughts? Anything to add? Darla, was your question answered?
Yeah, I just found it amusing, when I was reading through and he's saying, you know, whatever my eyes saw, I took whatever this, I did that, but yet I'm still wise. And it was just kind of like, really?
It doesn't say, yeah.
Can you qualify that?
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it, but yeah, again, we know that he did it with parameters, which was wise, just not with the wives and concubines.
How do we know them? I mean, I'm assuming he wrote this when he was an old man. He could make himself look good.
I don't know. I don't think he is. I don't think he makes himself look good at all. But the reason why we know that there are restrictions that he did put on himself due to his wisdom and faith is he says it. Even though we have verses like 9 that says, I didn't deny myself anything. But then, you know, a few verses earlier, he says, I did it with wisdom. So it becomes, when it's established, I did this with wisdom and with some sort of guidelines. When he says, I didn't deny myself anything, he's saying, I didn't deny myself within those guidelines. But he had the power to do whatever he wanted. Solomon was loaded, had a big kingdom, successful. He could do whatever he wanted, yet he didn't do everything he wanted.
Do you think maybe in that verse 26, to the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and happiness, but to the sinner he gives the task of gathering and storing it, wills to hand it over to the one who pleases God? Do you think maybe that in all this time while he was doing and he was building his wealth and stuff, that he got to the conclusion when he was working or to please God, he was more satisfied with himself than he was with all this time of accumulating stuff?
Most certainly. I don't think anyone who has a relationship with God would say, you know, yeah, my pursuit of these worldly things didn't pale in comparison when my relationship with God became the focal point. When I focused on Him, then true purpose in me. And that, countless testimonies of that. Countless testimonies of that. I remember there was an article of a man who said I quit my engineering job and I will never get another $112,000 a year salary, and I'm okay with that. That perspective.
I forget where I read this, but I read that the only things that you can truly keep forever are the things that you give away. And there's a lot of truth in that.
Yeah. Any final thoughts? I know it seemed like it was going down negative town, but he did give us that glimmer of hope of what is good and what is not the vapor. And I truly hope that spurs us to see that we are a part of an eternal thread which flows through the generations of our family. And we have a wonderful opportunity to give the infinite to infiltrate the finite and be able to give that meaning and purpose and fulfillment. All right, Randy, would you mind closing us in prayer?
Almighty God, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your wisdom. We thank you that we have hope beyond today, because if all we have is today, then we are above all to be pitied. And God, we're just so fortunate to be able to look beyond today and see what you can do tomorrow and what you will do tomorrow. And Lord, I just ask that you be with each of us as we go out. May we live with wisdom, and may we live with the knowledge that we live for something beyond today. And just give each of us strength to serve you. And all these things we pray in Christ's name. Amen.
Amen.